Introducing Sally Bedell Smith with your moderator, Patt Morrison.
Thank you for coming, everyone. Sally Bedell Smith is the author of a number of books, biographies, the two recent, The Queen, and the one we're talking about today, Prince Charles. So glad to talk to you again.
It's great to be with you, Pat.
The present Queen's great-grandfather was Edward VII, and his mother was Queen Victoria, who lived a very, very long time. And one day, Edward VII was having a conversation with a clergyman, I think it was the Dean of Windsor, and he said, "I'm very grateful for my eternal father, but why am I saddled with an eternal mother?" So this may be an anecdote with which Prince Charles is very familiar. He turned 70 this year, and his mother is hale and hearty, as it seems to be going. So, but this is a book about a man who's been famous since he was in utero. So as eventually he approaches the throne, what is it you wanted this book to do?
Well, I'll compare it with what I did with the Queen, which is we have this image of the Queen who is sort of the stoic, imperturbable figure that's what we know. That's what we've always known, who has a mystique. And so I wanted to get behind that curtain and show what she's like as a friend, as a mother, as a human being, and to show her sparkle and her wit and her mimicry and all the things that people who see that image, that very staid image, don't know about. In the case of Prince Charles, he's overshared a lot of his life, and he's talked about his feelings, and he's talked about his issues and his controversies and his problems, and so there was a surfeit of information like that I had, but what I needed to do was really wrap my arms around this incredibly sprawling life, and to find the influences, to find the people, the events who had shaped him, and to make sense of it all, really, to explain him, to understand him, to connect the dots in a way that people haven't before. And so I traveled the world with him. I went to Sri Lanka with him. I went to Malta. I watched him in action all over the place. I went to 7 dinners at Buckingham Palace and Windsor and Kensington Palace and St. James's Palace. I saw the way he interacted with Camilla. So I wanted, I wanted to explain him because he is really widely misunderstood. He has been stereotyped for a very long time as a sort of old fogey, the man who made Diana miserable. And I knew that it was a much more complicated, nuanced story than that. And he really turned out to be, a very complicated, paradoxical character, very, very different from his mother in so many ways. She took the throne at age 25, and she was a model of duty and rectitude and discipline. And he spent as Pat pointed out, his very long life in waiting, but also accomplishing an extraordinary amount of things. I mean, he is the longest serving Prince of Wales. He's the oldest person who will have ever taken the throne. He has waited the longest to take the throne, but he wasn't just out there drinking and womanizing and playing polo. I mean, he did play polo for a while, but he set himself up really beginning in the mid-70s to make a difference.
Well, let's talk about the influences in his life that made him the man he is. He had a difficult parental relationship, which he didn't hesitate to write about and talk about.
Right.
And he had a grandmother he loved.
Right.
And that drew him to a lot of older people, especially older men, who were not necessarily the best advisors for a man in his position.
Right. Well, one of his first and most important advisors was his great-uncle Dicky Mountbatten, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was the brother of Prince Charles's mother. And because his mother, Charles's mother, was from the time age 25, she was determined. She was a professional woman at a time when nobody in her generation was. All her friends were busy aristocratic women. And so she was really focused on proving herself, particularly to all those judgmental, stern, stiff-necked courtiers who surrounded her. And so she was busy doing that. She said, Philip, you be the head of the household. And they really, dictated Charles's life from the very beginning. But the one person in his life who he turned to was Dickie Mountbatten, because Dickie had the time and to give him the attention and the affection and the support that he required. And also, Dickie was a kind of magical figure to Charles because he had served in World War II. He had been the Viceroy of India, the last Viceroy of India, and he was also the godson of Queen Victoria, and had actually been held by Queen Victoria at his christening. And so he had all these extraordinary links to British history that he recounted to Charles, and he sort of taught him what he perceived to be the responsibilities of kingship. So he was a huge and hugely important advisor, but he gave him some really, really bad advice
Especially about
love
marriage.
life. He wrote him a famous letter on Valentine's Day in February of 1974, and he said, you must sow your wild oats, have as many affairs as possible before you settle down with a sweet-charactered girl who you can place on a pedestal. And so Charles proceeded to do just that. And he had lots and lots of affairs, including, as I discovered, with an American woman who he met in San Diego, the daughter of
That was Laura.
That was Laura Jo Watkins. And
Is she in the audience here?
is she here? No. She might be. She might be. But anyway, it was something that nobody knew about, but it was so fascinating because he was 25 and she was 20. And she knew, she said, he's like an old soul. She understood him. She was a very strict Catholic, and Catholics weren't allowed to marry into the royal family. But they had this kind of really sweet romance that went on for a while. A friend of mine who lives in Nassau arranged for them to have a 3-day rendezvous at a cottage on the beach called Xanadu. Nobody knew about it. And then they obviously couldn't, it couldn't last. So, he did invite her when the Annenbergs were at where he was ambassador. He invited her to London. She came and she stayed in the residence, and she even went to see his maiden speech in Parliament and at the House of Lords, and she was spotted, and the paparazzi and the reporters were chasing her all over London. They finally had to get her out of Dodge. So they dressed her in a sailor suit, and they sneaked her out of England. But they maintained this really sweet correspondence over the years, and in 1981, when Prince Charles and Diana were married in St. Paul's Cathedral, there, unbeknownst to anybody, sitting in the congregation was Laura Jo Watkins, which is really kind of sweet. He remained loyal to these people. He did. And when her father died, 10 years ago, he sent a beautiful bouquet of flowers and a lovely note. And that's kind of part of Charles that people don't understand. He has this incredibly sweet relationship with Nancy Reagan that she told me a lot about.
He can be very thoughtful. He also is a man with a boiling temper, like his grandfather.
Yeah.
When things go wrong a little bit. When things go wrong with the Queen, she gets a laugh out of it because her life is so stuffy that she likes seeing somebody trip and fall. There was a leader in Australia, a man, who actually curtsied to her.
Yeah.
Instead of bowing, and she got a lot out of that.
And that's where Prince Philip, by the way, comes in really handy, because people are absolutely frozen with nerves at the end, at the possibility of meeting her. And there are, lots of men have curtsied to her by accident. And so he goes along and he jollies people up, and he often says things that are a little inappropriate, but I always thought that he was he was saying things that she was probably thinking, and but I've watched him, and he watches her like with an eagle eye. He knows when she needs help, and when they were in Bermuda, I remember talking to one of her advisors, and she was looking around. She was saying, "Where's Philip? Where's Philip? Where's Philip?" And they got in the car, and a few minutes later, everybody, could see them, and they were just laughing uproariously because something had happened that made them both laugh. And that's the kind of relationship that they had. He was always there, watching her, making sure she was okay. If he saw a little kid who was behind the barrier and wanted to get a good look, he'd lift him up. But that's, if you watch The Crown, you would never know any of that about her. So that's a whole other subject.
With Charles, you do write sympathetically about him, but you say he's a man of many interests, but not really an original or deep thinker,
right,
which is probably a good thing in this job.
It is. You do not, I mean, that's true. You do not want to be too original. I mean, the Queen is very conscientious. She reads her daily briefs. She does her red boxes every day except Christmas and Easter, and even on weekends when she goes to friends. And I remember one friend of hers said to me that she asked her one morning, "Ma'am, why do you have to spend the morning reading your boxes?" And she said, "If I don't, I don't think I'll ever catch up." But she's so conscientious. Not to say that Charles isn't, but he has a much more wide-ranging intelligence. He's a more lateral figure. She's very, very, very deliberate, very linear, and she's not. She takes things as they come. She takes the world as it comes, and things don't really ruffle her all that much. Charles, one of her long-standing and much beloved advisors was a man named Martin Charteris, and he once said to the Queen, "Your job is..."
You've seen him in The Crown.
By the way, he's miscast in The Crown. It makes me very angry because I interviewed his widow, and he wasn't like that at all. I mean, he was in some ways, but he certainly wasn't cutting down trees in anticipation of getting a job and jumping the queue, which he wouldn't have done. But he once told her that her job was to spread a carpet of happiness, which I thought was so wonderful. And she sort of spent her life doing that. But Charles, who is more of a half glass empty kind of guy, and she's a half glass full kind of person, and he sort of looks at the tears and the holes in the carpet, and he wants to fix it. And that's really what he's done all across the board. One of the most it was almost embarrassing after I had written about the Princess of Wales, after I'd written about the Queen, how little I knew about what he has accomplished. I mean, who would know that Idris Elba, the star of The Wire, thinks that Prince Charles is one of the most wonderful people on the planet? Why? Because the Prince's Trust, which Charles started in 1976 to help disadvantaged young people get education, get a start in life by giving them little sort of micro grants, has helped nearly 1 million people. One of those is Idris Elba, who Prince's Trust grant enabled to go to acting school. And he says, "I love Prince Charles." Every time he gets a chance, he says that. But those are the kinds of things people really don't know about him, that he is widely misunderstood.
And he paints himself, he reads, he invites big thinkers to lunches, and then occasionally corrects them because he thinks he knows better than the big thinkers.
Well, yes, that is a problem. He's not an intellectual, but he likes to acquire information enough that will enable him to hold his own in a group with with people who really know things deeply. But one of the best things he does, and one of the things that I think he will do when he becomes king, is he's very good as a convener. And this is a sort of non-controversial thing that he has been doing it increasingly in recent years. For example, last summer he got the manufacturers of chocolate from the primary manufacturer, the Mars people and all those people who make chocolate, and he brought them to he convened them. He brought them to St. James's Palace.
Because who's going to turn down an invitation?
Because who
from the
turns
Prince of
down? I mean,
Wales?
that's the golden ticket, right? And he got them to sit around and talk about how to farm cocoa more sustainably, and they agreed on a set of principles. And whether they hold to them, we'll see. But the fact is that he was able to get them together to do something positive in an area that he cares deeply about, which is sustainability, is the kind of thing he can do as king without ruffling feathers. He loves, one of his really signature traits is his effort to make connections, to bring people together of different faiths, of different beliefs, and get them to find common ground.
And this is where it's kind of treacherous territory when he becomes the monarch.
Yeah.
Because he has already, to some people's way of thinking, overstepped the constitutional role. Maybe it would have been better if he'd been playing polo and screwing around for 70 years, but the idea that he has criticized elements of
Yes.
society, and Mrs. Thatcher, I think, once gave him a dressing down. Can he
She-
pull it back? to
She
be
did
king?
indeed. Well, he can't pull it back. I mean, it's a vast, vast archive of controversial things that he has said about architecture. I happen to think that he did some very positive things. He's a very modern thinker when it comes to urban planning. He even has a model village in Dorset that carries out all of his principles. But he has stepped on a lot of toes. He alienated the entire contemporary architecture community with his criticisms, like calling the proposed Richard Rogers addition to the National Gallery a carbuncle on the on the face of an elegant friend. I mean, that was not designed to win friends and influence people, but he did win. And in fact, the addition to the National Gallery, the Sainsbury wing, was done by American artist Robert Venturi, and it is totally compatible. There are people all over England who praise him for scuppering, as the British would say, plans that were going to be totally incompatible with the surrounding areas. He was way ahead on climate change. I mean, he has created probably the most controversy in his view on genetically modified agriculture. His father and his sister, Princess Anne, have publicly taken issue with that, as have a lot of scientists. But as one of his friends, the Marquis of Salisbury, I think, said to me, he said, "Look, when he becomes king, he's just going to have to put a sock in it. He is just going to have to stop saying those things." And in fact, when he becomes king, he can't, because everything that the monarch does is done on the advice of government. The Queen makes 2 speeches a year that are her own. One is her Christmas broadcast, and the other is the Commonwealth speech that she gives in March. Otherwise, everything is reviewed and, in many cases, written by members of the government or the advisors. So, he's at the stage now where he has probably said enough and done enough that, his legacy really is going to be what he has done as the Prince of Wales. And I've only touched on it. I mean, there's a lot in my book. I mean, who else would have saved 112 dilapidated buildings in Kabul, Afghanistan? Prince Charles did with his Turquoise Mountain Foundation. He's big on restoring old buildings. He created a traditional arts institute there that sells products all over the world, has created a room at the Connaught Hotel. These are things that people don't. He's helped many, many poor farmers in Britain to help, make a living when times were tough. And so this is his legacy. He will be, when he becomes king, he knows what the constitutional boundaries are, and unless he's, completely foolish. He will adhere to those. It's boring. I mean, Walter Baggett.
Being the monarch is boring.
Being,
Yes.
being a monarch is potentially quite boring.
Except for the jewelry, and it
except
just
for the
isn't going to
jewelry
look
and the
good
bling.
on him.
I mean, believe me, Prince Charles has some incredible bling. You just don't see enough of it, you know. He has it on little things, on his, on his sporrans and his kilts and everything, and beautiful cufflinks. Some of it was stolen by an Italian cat burglar, and
Who only stole Italian cats up until
yeah,
then.
well, but he happened to climb into St. James's Palace and steal all, and he told everybody what he had, because he was eventually killed, not by Prince Charles, but
See, that would have been good for his
I know
PR,
it would have
though.
been, but we know that he has bling, but really it's his wife who's going to get the major bling, which doesn't belong to them, by the way. A lot of it doesn't.
So why the New Yorker said he's a deeply unpopular man? Do you think that's true? And if that's the case, why?
Well, I think he was hugely popular back in the 70s. He was called Action Man. He came out to Los Angeles once, and there were women who were just grasping his hands and wanting to touch him and shake his hands, and he walked back into the hotel room. They were covered with cuts and bruises from all these diamond rings, and he said, "This is why my mother wears gloves." But there were adoring women pursuing him all over the place. He played polo, he water skied bare-chested, and there were all these pictures of women on Australian beaches running up to kiss him, and he was hugely popular until Princess Diana came along and completely stole his thunder, and it really, really bothered him, and that was the beginning of the decline in his popularity, because he was portrayed in large measure because of what she did to get her side of the story out there through the Andrew Morton book back in 1992 that she secretly and deceptively cooperated with. But that sort of set the template for him. And one of the things that he did after her death, which I think really helped him regain some of his popularity, is he really demonstrated to the world that he is, in fact, a very good father. He's been a very different sort of father from what his own father was. His father was very controlling. He told him he had to go to this school, he had to go to Gordonston, which Charles called Colditz and Kilts, and compared to a prison sentence, but it did do him some good, as his father thought it would. But Charles, with William and Harry, has had a much lighter touch. He allowed them to go to the schools they wanted to. They went to Eton, which is probably where Charles should have gone. And then, he allowed them to live relatively normal lives. I mean, William got to live for 8 years with Kate Middleton, whom he met at St. Andrews University. He went to Tesco and bought groceries and walked around with a shopping bag. And the press, because of the terrible problems that they had with Diana, the press gave him, really, really backed off. And so they've been able, for example, to choose their own advisors very wisely. They had 2 highly experienced military officers, plus one of the best veteran diplomats in Britain, who was the David Manning, who was
the U.S. ambassador.
He was U.S. ambassador. He's the gray-haired man in the room who's going to give him good advice, and he signed on with them in 2009, and he is still with them. And I said to him, I said, David, this is sort of amazing. He said, they won't let me go, and he gives them very good advice. And Charles did not hire him. The Queen thought of hiring him, and they immediately recognized what he would do. So, Charles has really let them make their own choices. He hasn't said, you will have to take over my philanthropies. They've developed a whole different range of philanthropies, most recently focusing on mental health issues. They haven't connected the dots directly to the problems their mother had, but it is in the back of their minds that she was never properly diagnosed or treated for a whole range of mental health problems.
And her own resistance to all of that.
And her own resistance, yeah. And Charles, by the way, one of the things that I found out in doing this book that just blew my mind, really, because the British family has not been known for its willingness to accept the existence of mental illness or emotional problems. There's a term called ostriching, and they just, sort of see something coming that they don't like, and they go, And but Charles, on their honeymoon, Diana had clearly gone off the rails, and he took her to London, introduced her to a very well-known psychiatrist named Dr. Alan McGlashan, and she went to him 8 times, but then she decided that the royal family was conspiring against her and wanted to subdue her, so she stopped. Prince Charles, to my astonishment, was in therapy for 14 years with Alan McGlashan, and I'm sure that helped him a lot.
I know that people have questions. We won't have time for questions, so I'm trying to anticipate a few of them. And one of them is why it is that people say, well, William is more popular, so Charles should abdicate and let William become king.
Yeah,
and why
I hear
this
that
has such a scar on the royal family that it's simply not going to happen.
Well, the abdication
Or the queen should abdicate rather in favor of William.
Those are two very, very difficult things, one to abdicate and one to skip. The abdication crisis of 1936 was a huge crisis for the royal family. It created a lot of instability, and but to everybody's everlasting good fortune, it created a path for the queen to become the queen, for little Princess Little Lilibet to become queen. So from that standpoint, it was good. But it created this, as I say, this sort of instability, this notion that the monarchy was precarious and could perhaps even be overturned. So there's that part of the question. The other part, which I had not really realized until, as I was doing the book on the Queen, I spoke to some Anglican clergymen, and they said, you don't understand the significance of the coronation. And maybe some of you watched the Smithsonian broadcast a week ago about the coronation, in which the Queen spoke about it. But as it was explained to me, the most important part of the coronation is not putting the crown on the head, the 7-pound crown, but it's the anointing and the sacred oath that the monarch makes to serve under God the subjects until death. The Queen is a very religious woman. She does not wear her religion on her sleeve, but she firmly believes in that. And so she has, she knows she can't retire. There was a wonderful thing that went around the internet when Pope Benedict retired, and it was a picture of Pope Benedict on the top, a picture of the Queen on the bottom, and in all capital letters with an exclamation point, it said "wuss." So she just believes. I talked to this wonderful cousin of hers who's no longer with us, named Margaret Rhodes, and the Queen was talking about one of the bishops of Canterbury who was retiring, and she said, I can just never do that. Now there's a caveat here, which is something called the Regency Act of 1937. And that provides a mechanism that if the Queen becomes incapacitated, either mentally or physically, there's a little council of people, civil servants, and one member of the royal family who will determine whether the Queen is fit to rule. If that determination is that she's not, Prince Charles would become the regent, as the Prince of Wales did when George III went crazy. And we had the Regency period, and then he became George IV. So something like that could happen, although, quite frankly, it seems unlikely. There are pictures of her quite recently, trotting on one of her safe conveyances, as her stud manager called him to me, a fell pony. big felt pony, safe conveyance. But she's out there riding. She's got a very good core, and she's mentally totally with it, as people who watched that show on the coronation could tell. I mean, she has an incredible memory. She does her boxes every day. She's obviously, as she approached her 90th birthday, she began stepping back from some of her public duties. Charles, I saw him twice represent her at a Commonwealth meeting in Sri Lanka. Last November at the cenotaph for the service of remembrance, honoring the war dead. Charles, for the first time, lay the wreath on behalf of his mother while the Queen and Prince Philip watched from a balcony. That was a big symbolic moment. And so we'll see more of that. But the Queen, behind the scenes, continues to be calling the shots and very involved.
And the other reason about Charles not stepping aside in favor of William has to do with, if you're not a hereditary monarchy, I mean, then what's the point?
Well, that's it. What's the point? If you make it optional, I mean, and also, it requires legislation. It requires, for him to step aside, it would be doing what Edward VIII did. You'd have to have legislation passed by Parliament and passed by the realms, all the parliaments of all the other realms, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Jamaica. I think there are 15 of them. And that would be an opportunity for them to say, okay, we'll ditch the monarchy. We'll have a head of state who's a former prime minister or something. But when you really put the question to people, okay, in the UK, in England, would you like to have, instead of the Queen, President Gordon Brown? President David Cameron? I mean, one of the wonderful things about a hereditary monarch in England, and one of my favorite descriptions of the Queen, is the light above politics. She is somebody who transcends the political machinations, the divisions, and who is not only the head of state, but is the head of nation. And Charles fully understands this, that this is part of the duty. You serve as an example of service and duty. And as one of her oldest friends, Lord Airlie, David Airlie, said to me, who served as her Lord Chamberlain for a number of years, he said, she is the sheet rock in the middle that we hang on to in times of trouble. And really, it's so important to have that role.
Because time is growing short, I do want to have you address a little bit the question of Diana and how in the 20 years, amazingly, 20 years since her death, our sense of who and what she has changed, and changed the perception of Charles accordingly.
Yes, I think that was really the case until last summer, which was month after month of commemorations of the 20th anniversary of her death, which for Charles was sort of like an acid flashback. Because there were here suddenly out of nowhere were videos that people hadn't seen before where she was saying terrible things about him, and audio tapes. And he had been making huge progress in being recognized for all the things that he had done, and Camilla has had a hard time getting accepted, and she celebrated her 70th birthday last summer, and she's, the tabloid reporters love Camilla. I've watched her with them. She's so nice to them, and most people in the royal family will see a tabloid reporter and go, and just not look at them. But she's really engaged. She sends them notes when their babies are born. So they were doing really well until last summer. And then they did take a dive in popularity. But I think he'll come back. I think, one of the most wonderful things that when I interviewed Mary Soames, the last surviving child of Winston Churchill, who adored Prince Charles, and she said to me, he has improved each shining hour in his wait for the throne. And I thought that was very Churchillian, first of all. But I think it's true. He has his faults. He has a temper, as you said, and he can be very petulant and self-absorbed and whatever. But certainly my take by the end of the book was that there was so much to admire. He's quirky, he's kooky. When he's in his bathtub, he drains it by hand and has a plastic tube going out the window to water his
He
plants.
should move to California. We all do that.
Yeah, true. Andres Duane, the architect, was there. He said, "Sir, what is that plastic tube coming out above the porte cochere in Clarence House?" "Oh, that's from my bathtub. I wash my..." And, but when people come to his garden at Highgrove and they're taking tours, he often lies down on the floor next to the window so he can eavesdrop on what they're saying about his garden. So he's quirky. But the British
love eccentrics,
British love
right?
quirky people, and so he has his quirks, and they're not. The Queen has quirks too, but they're just not as visible. But he is, he has done so much, and he cares so much. I mean, he really, really wants to make the world a better place, which, how can you fault him for that?
I'm sure a lot of people here have watched The Crown and
Oh,
would like
boy.
your assessment
Oh, boy.
of up, down, true, untrue, hilarious, awful.
Not hilarious. I become the human Google. Let's put it that way, on the ground. And the first season, and I'll preface it by saying that I worked with the creator and screenwriter Peter Morgan on his stage play, The Audience, which was wonderful. It starred Helen Mirren as the Queen and featured her relationship with most of her prime ministers. I worked with him for a year, which was fascinating for a biographer to kind of crawl inside the creative process of someone who is a playwright and uses historical figures. And he was pretty restrained in that, maybe because it was on the stage, maybe because he wasn't quite feeling his oats yet, but then he went on to do The Crown. And the first season, I thought was pretty good. I mean, the money they put into it, the quality of the acting. Peter is an amazing writer. He's witty and he's just one of the best. The period details, everything about it, which is why it's kind of dangerous, because it's presented as history, and it is not. It is, I had to use the word, but it is kind of fake history. There is a lot. He uses a historical superstructure. He uses events that really happened, and then he elaborates, invents, and in some places kind of willfully distorts things. I mean, the whole episode of the Kennedys, my poor husband who's sitting over there, I ruined his viewing experience, throwing pillows at the TV set and jumping up and down in my seat and saying, here's one, I'll give you two examples. One, there's no way in the world that that the Queen was jealous of Jackie Kennedy. I mean, the Queen is the least egotistical person you'd ever want to meet. She's very, very concerned about how the monarchy is perceived, how the behavior of everybody in the royal family affects the monarchy. As far as her own depiction, she's rather indifferent. So the idea that she would have gone off to Ghana to try and one-up Jackie Kennedy is just preposterous. Or that they would have sat down with their evening gowns among the corgis and exchanged confidences. I mean, Jackie never went to Windsor Castle. She never, she never confessed that she was being injected amphetamines by Dr. Feelgood, all these things. But, and I think they're unnecessary, because there are so many things that really happen that are, in a way, much, much more
like the
compelling
Titanic. Do you really have to invent people when the stories on board are so good?
And so I think that everybody should enjoy the beauty of it and the drama of it, but to maintain some measure of skepticism about it, because there is an awful lot that is invented, and the problem is it's only people like me who are totally immersed in the subject, who can immediately see what's true and what's false. one heartening thing was that I read that Wikipedia had a huge jump in searches about the Queen right after the Crown debuted. So at least people were, Wikipedia is not a perfect place to look. You could try my book, for example. But there isn't there, you know, it's problematic because more people are getting their history from, you know, visual, from TV, from movies, and it's just, you just have to take it with a very, very large pinch of salt, and then read up on it and find out
Sally,
what really happened.
As we get close to the end of our time together, I wanted to ask another question. I think people are wondering, will it be Queen Camilla or Duchess of Cornwall Camilla?
It is a very good question, because when they were married in 2005, Camilla was still very unpopular. And so what they said at the time was that she would be the princess consort when he became king. And
this is unprecedented.
yeah, there's never been a princess. They made it up, you know, just to kind of assuage people, because they just wanted this marriage to happen. But there's no doubt in my mind that Charles wants her to be queen. And in fact, according to British common law, she is fully entitled to be queen. Now, when the time comes and there is a surge of public opinion against that, they would probably accede to that because they don't want to create problems. But the fact is, to become princess consort, there would have to be legislation, because she would automatically, at the accession council on his mother's death, she would become queen. So I think, quite frankly, I think she has a right to be queen. She has been a very, very good Duchess of Cornwall. She wasn't able to take the title of Princess of Wales, to which she was, that was hers, but she knew what that would do. There wouldn't be very many people pleased about that, because there is only one Princess of Wales in everybody's mind. So we'll have to see, but I think she should be queen. And she has certainly adapted at age 57, when other members of her aristocratic class were putting up their feet and tending their gardens. She was going out and starting, attaching herself to charities, some of them quite edgy. She's been a real advocate for battered women, for rape victims. I mean, she's done some really, really good things. And I really think she deserves to be queen. Now, we'll see.
And it used to be treason to talk about the death of a sovereign, but the Queen will go eventually, and Charles will have a short reign. He
will have a short reign. He will. It's inevitable. And I think his legacy will be his many, many years and accomplishments as the Prince of Wales. But they're all set for it. They have what they call tabletop exercises. It's called Operation London Bridge.
And, for when the Queen dies.
When the Queen dies, and they're all set. Nobody's better organized for weddings and funerals than the royal family. Nobody does it better.
They actually get a kick out of planning their own funerals.
They get a kick out of it. Yeah, I mean and the Queen reviews it from time to time. She's a very, very practical-minded woman.
Well, it's a shame that we don't have time for questions, and Sally has to go on, but I've covered the royal family for 20 years, so I'll be out in the lobby answering questions like why there is no such person as Princess Diana. You'll figure out that mystery, but I first want you to
Princess Diana doesn't exist.
Thank you to Sally Bedell Smith
Pat.
and her book, Prince Charles.